Peter R. Breggin, MD, is called the conscience of psychiatry for his many decades of successful reform efforts. His scientific and educational work provide the foundation for modern criticism of drugs and ECT and lead the way in promoting more caring and effective therapies. His books include Talking Back to Prozac, Toxic Psychiatry, Medication Madness, Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, and now, Guilt, Shame, and Anxiety, Understanding and Overcoming Negative Emotions. Welcome to the Dr. Peter Breggin Hour.
Hello, my wonderful, wonderful audience. Another summer day, getting near the end of the summer in upstate New York, Ithaca, New York. Once again, in front of my great big glass window, looking at a cardinal enjoying itself on the feeders out in front. It's a good day. I hope you all are having a good day, too. And my guest today, you've heard him on recently. Let me just make sure he's here again today. Patrick, are you there?
Yes, right here.
Well, you sound loud and clear. How do I sound?
Say that again?
How do I sound?
Oh, yeah, you sound fine.
I was concerned about my connection when I called in today. I'm doing it a slightly different way.
Yes, I
things
can hear
are
you
very
fine.
good here, folks. I look forward to talking to you about a very interesting kind of putting together of ideas about the nature of psychosis. Before I get there, let me remind you that my website, Breggin.com, www.breggin.com, there you can find the frequent alerts. They're free. You can use those to keep track of what we are doing at the website, what I'm doing around the world, whatever's going on that we think is important at the time to share with you, the free frequent alerts. And you can find the daily breaking news where every day new stuff goes up about psychiatry, psychology, mental health, the good and the bad, anything that's hopeful, some of the worst stuff that you might not really understand if you were going almost any other website. Also, remember for the show, there's an app you can listen to. There's a PRN app you can get, and you can call in. You can call into the show. We ask you to call in about the show of the day or something close to it, 888-874-4888, 888-874-4888. My guest today, Patrick Hahn, is actually his training and his work is in the area of biology. He's at Loyola University. He's a freelance writer. I've known Patrick for many years, and his book, it's his first book. I thought Patrick had a few books because he's always writing interesting things. But his book is Madness and Genetic Determinism, Is Mental Health in Our Genes? But the book is about so much more. It's about many of the subjects we're going to talk about today. And he covers everything in psychiatry from the asylum era of moral psychiatry to Chestnut Lodge and Frieda Fromm-Reichmann. A lot of things. He talks about Nazi Germany in some great detail. R.D. Lang and Kingsley Hall and Soteria House and Open Dialogue. It's a very interesting coverage of some of the more interesting aspects in our history. Today, we're going to focus on schizophrenia and psychosis and what the world is it? Is it genetic? Is it biologic? Is it psychological? What place does trauma play in it? What do we really know? And we'll probably spin off into some other areas. And one area that we just have to keep coming back to is the big question, the genetics. We hear the genetics so often being discussed for psychiatric problems. Schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, ADHD, whatever's being pushed at the time, whatever gets research money rolling at the time. gets looked at and there's hot talk about genetics. Is there any fire at all under the hot talk about genetics? What's the very latest, Patrick?
Well, in my book, I review the history of psychiatric genetics, which began in 1918 with Ernst Rudin in the Institute for Psychiatric and Genealogical Studies. And so a century of psychiatric genetics now beginning its second century, a century of research has found no credible evidence that these are genetically based conditions. In fact, I contend they've shown pretty decisively that they are not genetically based. So my book reviews the whole history of psychiatric genetics, beginning with family studies, twin studies, adoption studies, and I contend that all of these studies are fatally flawed in ways that cannot be fixed. And then we come to the molecular biology era. So linkage studies came up completely empty-handed. The researchers themselves...
Describe what a linkage study is for folks.
Well, they look for a family in which a condition runs in the family, and then they try to then they look for a piece on one of the chromosomes that is found, a genetic variant in one of the chromosomes that's found in every one of the family members that has a condition. Now, that works for conditions in which the mode of inheritance is already well known, which is not the case for schizophrenia or any of the other so-called mental illnesses. So linkage studies do not test the hypothesis that a trait is genetically determined. All they tell you is what is the likeliest location in the genome for this gene, assuming it exists at all. And so there were a number of studies published claiming to have found the gene for schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, and always turned out, they always ended up retracting them, and the retraction never got anywhere near as much publicity as the initial announcement. And then they went on to candidate gene studies. So they would look at genes that they already knew were involved in the development of the central nervous system and tried to find some mutation that correlated with schizophrenia or other mental illnesses. And they did hundreds and hundreds of studies. And the thing is, when you're doing hundreds of studies, you're going to get some false positives just by chance. So, but the researchers eventually concluded, again, there was no evidence any of these genes were implicated in schizophrenia. In fact, sometimes you get two studies, one claiming a genetic variant made the condition more likely, and some they're less likely. So they came up empty-handed. Then along comes genome-wide association studies. So, try not to get too technical on our listeners. But in a genome-wide association study, you look at, you sequence the genome, you get tens of thousands of people with the index condition, tens of thousands of people who don't have it, sequence their DNA, and look for genetic variants that are correlated with the index, the condition of interest. And they found a couple hundred. And so that's the basis for these announcements we're always seeing now, that scientists have found the gene for schizophrenia or the gene for depression. And what the news stories never tell you is how tiny these correlations are, on the order of 1 in 500 increase in risk or even less. And Well, we have some of the world's leading schizophrenia genetics researchers right here in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins. And I asked one of them, suppose you took a test and you found you had a gene that gave you a 1 in 500 increase in your risk of being diagnosed with schizophrenia. What would you do differently? And he said, probably nothing. So then that led me, so I found there's no strong genetic component, but that's still being pushed by psychiatry because if you tell people, in fact, they even say this openly in the literature, if you tell people these are genetically based conditions, that makes them more likely to take the drugs or to give their kids the drugs. And the question that ought to immediately spring to mind is, if these drugs are helping people, why do they have to resort to subterfuge to get people to take them?
Yeah, that's well put, Patrick Hahn. That is very, very well put. And they're saying, well, it must be a multiple of different genes that come together. But that has no more evidence than anything else, does it?
Yeah, and something I didn't go into in my book, but I should have, is even these tiny correlations may be just statistical noise. Something called population stratification. I'll try not to get too technical on your listeners, but I think it's a good possibility that Chinese immigrants are more likely to use. I mean, the problem is that the genome-wide association studies is based on the idea that the index cases and the control cases are not are otherwise comparable, and that's an absolutely indefensible assumption. We know that these conditions like schizophrenia and other mental illness correlate with poverty, with minority status. So any gene that's more common in oppressed ethnic minorities is going to be correlated with these conditions. That doesn't mean it's causing it. I mean, I'll give an example to your listeners just to make it clear what I'm talking about. I think it's probably a good possibility that Chinese immigrants are more likely to use chopsticks than the general population. So you could sequence the DNA of some Chinese immigrants and find allelic variations that are more common with them than in the general population. And if I were to call these chopsticks-associated alleles, you would laugh in my face. But there's exactly as much evidence for that as saying these are schizophrenia-associated alleles. There's a correlation, a tiny correlation, but absolutely no evidence of causation. So I was led to the conclusion that there's no strong genetic component to these illnesses. So that made me ask the question, what does cause them?
Just going
and
back,
I know you said in your book,
Patrick, hang on.
Psychiatry.
Yes. Going back on a few of these issues, I mean, I remember when I first went and started reading the literature in the 1930s, and they had hundreds of studies that were considered positive in those days, and none of them are considered positive now. This is really
and
quite
these, you read these eugenics texts from 100 years ago. You'll look at these pedigrees, and the filled-in squares and circles could represent schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or major depression or alcoholism or morphinism or criminality or vagrancy or sexual
What are you saying? I'm losing you a little bit there. What are you saying? What
I'm saying is these studies that were 100 years ago, you look at them, and they were you would see this just vast variety of human woes that were lumped under the condition mental lumped under the rubric of mental illness. Now, it's hard to find a family that doesn't have one or more of these conditions running in the family. So this was held up as proof of the genetic nature of mental illness.
Yeah.
And it's utterly absurd.
Everything runs in family. The language you speak, the ball teams vote, you root for, your languages you speak, it all runs in families, but it doesn't say anything about, as a proof that something is genetic, that it appears in families.
Exactly.
One of your chapters is about the family with the twins, where all how many twins were there? They were all emotionally
quadruplets.
disturbed.
Yeah, the Janane sisters.
Yeah, and they were just
and that's the most famous case history in psychiatric genetics. These 4 identical quadruplets, all of whom were diagnosed with catatonic schizophrenia in their early 20s. And so they were taken to the National Institute of Health for 3 years of intensive study, and they did electroencephalographic analysis and handwriting analysis and analyzed photographs of the placenta, and they produced this volume. Some 25 different researchers contributed to it, and it's a massive tome. It's over 600 pages in length. And this is still being cited today as proof of the genetic nature of schizophrenia.
I didn't realize that people are still citing that. Oh, God.
Yeah, and it begins, the book tells the story of their lives, and so it's being cited as proof of the genetic nature of schizophrenia, but what it really shows is the willful blindness, the unwillingness of psychiatrists and psychologists to look at the evidence that is literally right before their eyes. The book tells the story of the sisters' lives. It's 125 pages of abuse that began literally when these girls were in the cradle and their father knocked their heads together, he said, to keep them from crying. And so physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. He kept his wife and daughters in line with threats to kill them, and nobody doubted that he was capable of it. He had guns, and he was willing to use them. He once did fire his gun at his wife, put a hole through her nightgown. Didn't hit her, but put a hole through her nightgown. And he later said he thought she was a murderer.
I want you to imagine that this is real, because I've read this book. And this, I think it was actually put out under the imprimatur of the NIMH, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Yeah, the National Institutes of Health, yeah. Yeah, and
unless you read the book, you wouldn't know that there was a history of child abuse and wife abuse.
Yeah.
He also abused people outside the family.
Yeah, well, he almost certainly did murder another man. The details are in my book. And for the rest of his life, he would wake up in the middle of the night from nightmares of murder, screaming, and demand his gun and search the house for intruders. Imagine you're one of these girls, and there's a maniac with a gun charging through your house, night after night. What are you going to do? You're going to hunker down under the covers and remain absolutely still and quiet. And what is
now
catatonia?
Imagine you're a famous scientist, geneticist. You know all these stories. You know the fact that this is going on. I tell you, to maintain, one of the big lessons is that to maintain the psychiatric viewpoint, you have to be willing to ignore every piece of reality that comes your way. You just have
not one of these 25 distinguished researchers ever asks the obvious question: who wouldn't be crazy after surviving that horror show of a childhood?
Yeah. It's really quite astonishing, folks, and it gets us into the second kind of big question after the genetic one, which is, well, how often do we get this kind of information that there's a relationship between severe emotional disturbances, whether they get labeled schizophrenic or bipolar, whatever they get labeled, people being upset, people being very emotionally distressed and manifesting it in all the different ways we human beings can do, including losing our minds. I mean, is it rare that these people have had terrible upbringings or violent experiences?
Yeah, it's quite common. There was a study published in so I concluded it's not in the genes. Nobody is born schizophrenic. Nobody's born having schizophrenia or any other mental illness. So that led me to the question, what does cause these conditions? And are they related to trauma? And I found there is a mountain of evidence which shows beyond a doubt that these conditions are caused by childhood sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and every other category of trauma and loss. This correlation is robust, reliable, dose-dependent. Every study that has looked for a correlation has found it. It's been demonstrated in case control studies, prospective cohort studies, cross-sectional population studies. I mean, what common people have known since time immemorial is absolutely true. Bad things happen, and they can drive you crazy.
Especially if they happen systematically and over again when you're a little person before you're grown up. If it affects your very relationship to other human beings and leaves you feeling helpless and disturbed and distressed and distrustful in your human relationships, which is
getting back to the Janane sisters, the father, they called him Henry in the book. He kept his wife and daughters isolated. The girls were not allowed to play with other children, even their own cousins. They weren't allowed to go to parties, picnics, dances. They weren't allowed to talk on the telephone. They weren't allowed to work after-school jobs. Just goes on and on and on. His wife, she didn't have strong family support to begin with. But when her mother came to visit, the father, her husband was so nasty to her, she never came back again. And he insisted on reading her mail whenever she wrote to her parents. And at one point, she actually saw a lawyer about a divorce. And they met with a lawyer, and the husband promised to mend his ways, and then afterwards he told her, if you try to leave me, I will find you wherever you go, and I will kill you. And there's another thing that wasn't mentioned in the book, but I was able to find out.
Patrick?
Yeah, go ahead.
Are you bringing in things from outside this book?
Just one detail that I'm bringing in. The oldest daughter, I was able to find their true identity. I won't say their names on the air. The father, the book identified him as a government official, but they didn't say what his position was. In fact, he was constable. The guy was a cop with a badge and a gun. Now, imagine you are a mother. It's 1944. You're a mother with 4 crazy daughters, and your husband is not just a homicidal maniac. He's a cop. What were her chances of getting away from him?
Yeah. You said that you had brought one thing out of the book.
Yeah, that he was a constable. And also, one of the sisters is still alive.
I'm making, Patrick, hang on a second. The point I'm making, folks, is here's a book. The Janane
Quadruplets.
And in it is all this data.
Yep.
All this data is in it. And it's used by scientists, and now Patrick is telling me, which I didn't believe at first, because how could this be? It's still being cited by modern works, I haven't noticed that, as some sort of evidence that it must be genetic, because here, all these girls have the same fate of being deeply emotionally disturbed, even though the book makes clear that this man is one of the single most abusive males toward his own family that's ever been documented. And it's all in the book. It's all in the book. That's why you just can't believe anything that comes out of the psychiatric establishment. I mean, if a week from now there's a great new study showing this or that, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything. I've been now reading psychiatric literature since I was probably 15, 16, 17, 18. I mean, if I've been reading it since I was 20, that's 63 years ago. And this is the story again and again. We go back to Ernst Rudin, whom Patrick Hahn brought up as one of the very original researchers in the field. And what is his history? Starts researching in 1910. Well, what is he doing in the early 1930s? He's Hitler's chief psychiatrist. That's who he goes on to be, Hitler's chief psychiatrist, who frames the initial legislation for eugenical sterilization and gets the Iron Cross or some other award from Hitler.
Yeah, the Eagle Shield of the German Reich.
What was that?
The Eagle Shield of the German Reich.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. Yeah, and now this then led to the T4 program for the mass murder of mental patients in Germany.
He's a big part. Rudin was a big part of, ultimately, of the Holocaust, because he was a big part of giving Hitler all the scientific confirmation he needed for people, some groups of people being inferior genetically, and not a single one of his studies ever really is cited, as far as I know.
And
it's such a crazy situation that of this whole context of psychiatry. Just got to keep it's so hard. Keep reminding yourself the history, the story of this profession and its research.
Yeah, and these German now Rudin was not directly involved in the T4 program, but his work, this program for the mass murder of mental patients, it was set up and run by psychiatrists. Rudin was not directly involved, but it was his work that provided the ideological justification. And Rudin was, he was the dean of German psychiatry. He was on the board of all the journals. All the levers of power came back to Ernst Rudin. And, these men who administered this program, they were not cranks or fringe figures. These were men at the top of their profession with national and even international reputations. And now we shudder at the Nazi horrors, but it seems to me that the lesson to be learned is whatever else you can say. I mean, that was the settled science of the day, that some people and some races were genetically inferior. It seems to me the thing to do, the most important thing to do, is to learn the lesson and ask, what is there about the settled science of today that I believe that future generations might find odious and absurd?
Well, hopefully, but if psychiatry continues to have its power in the culture will never find the stuff odious and absurd that you and I do, because the culture is so deeply embedded with the psychiatric power, and more today than ever, of course. I mean, more people on drugs, more studies proving this and that. So more than ever, we live in a psychiatric culture. One of the things I remember from my studies of this stuff, Patrick, was the delight of some branches of the psychosocial medical sciences that Hitler was the first mental hygiene leader of a country.
Mm-hmm.
the first mental hygiene-oriented leader of his country, because he was so interested in all the aspects of the genetics and the biology of some people being inferior to other people.
Yeah, and of course, one of Rudin's protégés was Franz Kallman. He was another psychiatrist, and he spoke at a conference in 1935, and he claimed that schizophrenia is caused by a single recessive gene, and he advocated the sterilization not just of all people diagnosed with schizophrenia. He claimed a recessive gene means you have to have two copies, and he said we should sterilize everybody who has even one copy as a precautionary measure. And there was a geneticist at the conference, Fritz Lenz, who rose to object. Now, I should make it clear to our listeners, Lenz was not a good guy. A year later, Lenz and Rudin oversaw the forced sterilization of 385 children of French colonial African German women and French colonial African troops who'd been stationed in Germany after the war. So Lenz was not a good guy. There were no good guys in this sorry mess. But what Lenz had to say is this. He said, assuming the consensus figure for lifetime incidence of schizophrenia is 1 in 100, and assuming this is caused by a recessive gene, if you want to sterilize all the people who have one copy of the gene, you're going to have to sterilize 1 out of every 5 Germans. So that proposal was quietly shelved. And then a couple of years later, Kallman had to flee Germany one step ahead of the Gestapo to avoid persecution as an undesirable himself because of his Jewish ancestry. And you might think having been on the wrong end of eugenics policies would have changed Kallman's mind about the subject, but it did not. He went on to become the founding father of psychiatric eugenics in America.
Well, this is true, folks. There was a man that was too radical, literally. He was actually too radical at the time for German psychiatry, Nazi. What's really German psychiatry? It's not Nazi psychiatry. Nazis loved it, but it's just plain old good German psychiatry. Man who was too radical there was welcome here. So to think it couldn't have happened here, well, our scientists, many of them were very, very sympathetic with what was going on in Nazi Germany, and this is a part of human evil that we have to live with. And in many ways, psychiatry always comes back to epitomizing aspects of human evil: lobotomizing people, electroshocking people, putting people in categories, objectifying people, treating people as objects, acting like people are diseases, not human beings struggling with life, being authoritarian, having huge state mental hospital lockups. It's just, you just have to look at that within America. Psychiatrists behave exactly, pretty much, as they did in Nazi Germany. They just simply never had a Führer to unleash them, because the American Psychiatric Association, in the middle of the murder of mental patients going on, which is well known to the leadership here, in the 1940s, the American Psychiatric Association journal, the APA journal, came out in favor in an editorial of not just sterilizing 4 or 5-year-old children who were declared, mentally retarded, mentally disabled, of not just sterilizing them, but of killing them. If they were irredeemable, it wouldn't get better. Killing them. It's in an editorial. And by the way, I have a paper on my website that Patrick's well aware of, The Murder of Mental Patients, Psychiatric Holocaust. You can just search it and find it. that really looks into all this data we're moving on to now. Let me bring you out of some of the darker stuff again, though, and talk about, we do know a lot about the trauma issue.
Yes.
Are there any particular studies that come to your mind that illustrate this? I don't know. I didn't prepare you to pop up with a study. I mean,
John Reed is a professor of clinical psychology at the University of East London.
Yep, he's been on our show.
Oh,
go ahead.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he's the leading figure in this field, and he has collated the evidence, and he's published a number of reviews on the subject. And for many years, psychiatry not just denied that abuse had any role in the etiology of so-called mental illnesses, but in the case of sexual abuse, they just denied that it didn't happen. And there was, as late as 1975, there was a popular psychiatry textbook that estimated the frequency of incest as 1 in a million.
Oh, my God.
And now we know something like 1 out of 4 girls are sexually abused, 1 out of 6 boys. And within my lifetime, they were telling people it was 1 in a million.
Yeah. We've had on, folks, Jeffrey Mason. You can go back, by the way. We have an archive on our on Breggin.com, on the website. And again, we're talking today with Patrick Hahn. And you can get some of the shows with Jeffrey Mason. You can see what the content are. And Jeffrey was the one who blew the whistle on Freud being aware that many of his patients, maybe most, were sexually abused as children. And finding that this was so horrible to his contemporaries that they were going to just totally abandon him if he kept talking like that. So he stopped talking like that, and he literally blamed the children, in effect, saying, oh, they made these fantasies up. You have an Oedipus complex, and you are imagining, desiring, wishing for sex with your mother, your father, your uncle, or whoever. And, I mean, when I first read that, I was probably in high school, and I said, that's nonsense. I already had enough experience to know that the only leering I saw between adults and children was the part of the adults leering at the children. I never saw any children leering at adults. And, I mean, it was just patently wrong to me, at a fairly young age. But it just all gets distorted and twisted, including, we're talking now about the origins of psychotherapy in Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis. It maintained till its dying day. It's pretty much died now, but to its dying day, it was maintaining that it was a lie that children were being widely sexually abused. So it set back the liberation of children, the understanding of childhood, and the understanding of women, and so on and so forth. It just set it back a long time, and I think probably we're still suffering from the Freudian nonsense on some level or another. Just today, Patrick, as we're talking, more than ever, it just makes me want to just say, folks, look out for my profession of psychiatry and also for the psychotherapies, because they are done by human beings who have too much power and too much arrogance and too much authority, and it leads to too much corruption. And just be very careful about what you buy from the overall mental health system, what you believe. You think I'm exaggerating, Patrick?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, of course, Freud had patient after patient come into his office and tell him about having been sexually abused as children, mostly women, but some men as well, always beginning before the age of 8. And he concluded, reasonably enough in my opinion, that these early childhood violations had something to do with their present-day problems. And he published 3 papers on the subject, all in the year 1896. And then a year later, he just did a screeching 180-degree reversal, and he said, no, these violations never happened. These were just infantile fantasies. Now, let's take a minute to consider how bizarre Freud's position becomes at this point. Because he was adamant that these conditions that we now call schizophrenia and major depression and so forth were diseases, no less than smallpox, his comparison, not mine. And now he was saying that these diseases were caused by events that never happened. Is that even a coherent position?
I never thought of it that way. These are diseases caused by imagination. False imagination.
Yeah, and then, of course, there's a bizarre postscript to this story. Almost 40 years later, Freud's disciple came to the same conclusion, Sandor Ferenczi. And like Freud, Ferenczi had patient after patient come into his office and claim that these dirty, disgusting things had been done to them when they were small children. And unlike Freud, he had a ready reply to the people who would dismiss this as mere infantile fantasies, because he'd also had patient after patient come into his office and claim to have done these dirty, disgusting things to small children. So he gave his presentation. He presented his findings at the International Psychoanalytic Contest, and Ernest Jones promised to have his findings published in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. And then a year later, Ferenczi died of pernicious anemia, and Jones just went back on his word and had the proofs of Ferenczi's paper destroyed.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and here's I drew heavily on Mason's book for my chapter on trauma and psychosis. And so after, Jeffrey Mason, of course, is a psychotherapist, and he discovered all this information.
He quit. He never practiced. Actually, he decided he wasn't a good therapist. God bless him. And he never actually practiced. He became more of an academic and was the head of the Freud archives when he made friends with all the folks, Anna Freud, the daughter, and got all this. You probably know this part. Got all the information that we're talking about from letters that Anna had looked at, but quote paid no attention to, but somehow let Jeffrey read them, and these letters led to the knowledge of Freud's angst, as he found he was going to be completely ostracized from everybody if he kept talking about the men in his culture rampantly abusing children.
He shared his findings with Freud's daughter Anna, who wrote to him in reply. I've got it right here. I've got the book open in front of me. Keeping up the seduction theory would mean to abandon the Oedipus complex, and with it the whole importance of fantasy life, conscious or unconscious fantasy. In fact, I think there would have been no psychoanalysis afterwards. And she may well have been right. Maybe there would have been no psychoanalysis, at least as we know it. Maybe instead of inventing complexes and drives out of thin air, the way modern psychiatrists now invent chemical imbalances out of thin air, maybe they would have turned their attention towards solving people's real problems that were caused by real events. Who knows how the world might be a different place today as a result?
Yeah, might be a lot kinder place. at least mental health professionals would have a chance to have been a lot kinder. Although, I do see among many, many therapists that I meet and talk with just a growing consensus about the fact that, people suffer because of the trauma they've been through, and that a caring therapeutic relationship empowers people to understand that and to get past it and to, learn to live their lives. So that despite all this chaos and violence and hatred in psychiatry itself, there is a profession of psychotherapy, of professionals who are out there, many of whom really are helping people. But how do you tell them from the others? And how do you tell who's a good therapist and who's a bad one? And that's a lot of what Jeffrey Mason ended up concluding, that how in the world can you have an official profession of good, loving people who are open-hearted and understanding and wise and can help other people? How do you ever create this? How do you select the people for it? And that is still a great puzzle for me. To this day, as much as I believe that I'm helping people, and I know other therapists that are helping people, and we have very similar values about a lot of what we're saying and thinking, how do you build a profession that's safe from the corruption of power, and how do you select these good people? And it's a real problem, folks. And
that's why I'm happy to be. I've been asked to be plenary speaker for the International Society for Ethical Psychiatry and Psychology. They're having their annual meeting here in Baltimore next month, and it's going to be psychologists and trauma survivors and people like that getting together and talking about new ways of looking at these conditions that we've called mental illnesses. And so I'm pretty excited that I'm going to be a part of that. Irving Kirsch is going to be there. You know who he is, of course. He was the author of The Emperor's New Drugs.
Yeah,
and that book was
somebody who's been a number of times on our show, too.
Yeah. That book was the first half of a 1-2 punch combination from which biological psychiatry may never recover. The other, of course, was Robert Whitaker's book, The Anatomy of an Epidemic.
Yeah.
But still, every day or every week, there's new news stories about how these are genetically based conditions.
Right.
And here's a wonderful quote
I want to remind my audience that, and I'm not sure that I've made you aware of this or that you know about it. The latest horror that I am profoundly concerned with, along with psychologist Michael Cornwall from California, is the use now. It's been approved by the FDA based on about 32 kids for 4 weeks. They're unleashing on the world, probably on millions. I don't know how we're going to stop this. Putting electrodes onto the heads of children to have them be electrically disrupted throughout the night, sufficiently to change the shapes of their brain waves, make them abnormal, with electricity through their brains. It's been approved for so-called ADHD, which is not a disease, a disorder. It's a bunch of behaviors that annoy parents and teachers at times, being too active, not paying attention to boring stuff, wanting to play on the computer rather than go to school, and so on and so forth. It's just really about normal kids growing up, and learning to adapt or not to adapt to school and things like that. It's just all kids. And they're called ADHD when there's nothing wrong with them, and often their environments are boring or authoritarian or irrelevant, or there are more interesting things going on that they'd rather be doing. Or some of them are very anxious and upset kids, but that's not what the diagnosis is about. It's just about being too wrapped up in what you're interested in and not enough what the parents and schools are interested in. And we're going to put
I'm going to be wanting to. I saw your article and Dr. Cornwall's article about that in the Mad in America blog. Yeah, I'm going to be wanting to speak to you about that in the near future, actually. I've just submitted the proposal for my second book, and now I'm sketching out in my head the outlines for the third, which I'm going to call A Mania for Drugging Children.
Yeah, I'd love to, help inspire you with that book on the drugging of our kids. It's just an awful thing, and the marketing. You talked about in your book. You got a chapter on the mass marketing of mental illness. The degree, folks, that industry collaborates with government, which collaborates with these guilds like the American Psychiatric Association, the AMA. These structures set up to empower doctors. The degree to which it just looks for and reaches for psychiatric consumers is just mind-boggling. It's not by chance when NIMH says, 20% of Americans need psychiatric drugs. And, now we're actually going to have more than that if we don't already on psych drugs. It's marketing. This data is just marketing. You can define mental illness in any way you want. Every single human being has things that bother them and upset them and make them function at times less lovingly or rationally than they want to. Folks, it's a part of being alive. And, we just struggle. People struggle. So you could define 100% of people as mentally disturbed. Which, interestingly enough, I think Freud and some of his colleagues did do. They really did say they thought that they were the only sane people in the world because they knew about psychoanalysis. They really talked about that kind of thing.
It's amazing because there's been a lot of attention in the media lately about mass shootings. And we have people, and we have these psychiatrists saying that they're not caused by mental illness. Well, wait a minute. I've talked to people, I've listened to people, or sometimes they're surviving loved ones whose lives were destroyed by psychiatric drugs and who began taking them for the most banal reasons you could imagine. Their girlfriend broke up with them. They were sad because their girlfriend broke up with them. They were worried about their upcoming exams. There was a little boy who liked to run around the house in circles for hours. And I didn't talk to him. I talked to his mother because he's not here to tell us his story because he committed suicide after abruptly terminating the drugs he was on. So apparently now, being sad because your girlfriend broke up, presumably all these people were diagnosed with a drug-treatable mental illness. So being sad because your girlfriend broke up with you is a mental illness. Being worried about your exams is a mental illness. A little boy running around the house in circles has a mental illness. Apparently everything now is a mental illness except mass violence, mass shootings. I find that so absurd. I can't even find the words to describe how absurd I think that is.
Yeah. It's so interesting. It's so interesting, Patrick, because I've just been talking with Ginger about this. I've been saying this is the most amazing thing. My colleagues are willing to call everything that happens in the normal run of conflict and unhappiness a mental illness. But they're going to say, but it's not mental illness if you're 18 years old and you go into your school and you kill a dozen people or so. Or you go into a kindergarten and shoot 20 people in the head or whatever. That's not a mental illness. And I think that it's interesting that psychiatry doesn't want to go there. Why? I think it partly doesn't want to go there and say, well, that obviously is the worst mental illness of all. It's doing the most damage and harm, and it makes the least sense. It must be the worst mental illness of all, because they don't want to be held at all responsible for this. Maybe that's it. I don't know. Why do you think the profession wouldn't say, well, of course this is our stuff. We're the experts in mental illness. We're the experts in people being violent. We lock up people to prevent violence. We know all about violence because obviously this horrible violence is a mental illness, but no, it's not. What do you get out of that, my friend?
Yeah, I mean, in the book, in my second book, I talk about the Westbecker case, in which you were the star witness for the plaintiffs. And for the listeners, Joe Westbecker was a former pressman, and he went into his former place of work and murdered 8 people and wounded 12 more. And this was after a psychotic break that he had after starting on Prozac. And during the trial, one of the witnesses for the defense said, no, it didn't have anything to do with the drugs. It was his God-given free will. And I'm thinking to myself, then why do we need psychiatrists? Why can't people who are depressed or anxious use their God-given free will to make changes in their lives so they're no longer depressed or anxious?
Well, it's exciting you're going to be writing about Westbecker. I've got I don't know if you're aware, I have a very extensive section on it in Medication Madness, and I have a lot of stuff that hasn't been made public, so we should get together at some point when you're working on Westbecker and let me share my
We already did, if you'll
with
recall.
Did we talk about it enough?
Yeah, I think so. I just submitted the proposal for that book last week, so let's keep our fingers crossed.
Okay. Yeah, well, good luck. Good luck.
So maybe you can have me on next year to talk about that one.
Oh, yeah, we'll have a lot more. I forgot that I'd already been involved with you on it. It's hard for me to keep track of the stuff I'm still doing, folks. All that.
So am I going to have to come up with a new book for you every year now?
Well, that'd be exciting. I'd love it.
Okay, I'll do my best.
It's always a pleasure to have you on. You are so rational. You are so hardworking and so research-oriented about all of this stuff. It's just amazing to have you on talking about all this. And there's the music. Patrick Hahn and the book, Madness and Genetic Determinism. Thanks again, Patrick. We will have you back again and again as the years go on.
Okay, thank you. Have a great day.
And bye, my wonderful audience. Bye. Thank you for being there. Thank you. Bye-bye.